you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The first lockdown brought most of the world to a standstill, and many were quick to point out the silver lining, the significant drop in carbon emissions. However, this pollution reduction was short-lived, and past crises indicate that we might be standing at a crossroads when it comes to our climate goals. What has this unprecedented year meant for the efforts to curb climate change and protect the environment? The answer really depends on who you listen to. But what we'll do today is bring to you some of the events that shaped the year. Do stay with us. Floods in August across northwest Nigeria destroyed 90% of the 2 million tons that Kebbi State officials expected to harvest. The loss amounted to some 20% of the rice Nigeria grew last year. Kebbi State government said at the time that it lost 1 billion naira worth of rice and other farm produce to ravaging flood recorded in 15 out of 21 local government areas in the state. Farther south, outside Nigeria's capital, Abuja, chicken farmer Adigwe was also worried. A shortage of maize forced him to sell most of his flock of more than 1,000 birds, and the 300 left were hungry. Chicken feed prices were more than doubled, and he wasn't sure how long he can cook.
What I have done to continue staying in the market is by reducing my capacity, because everything I have done is according to budget. So when the corn, the price of the corn increased, what I did was to cut down on my capacity so that I could fit in the budget I have and to meet the market demand.
Twin crises, floods, and maize shortages came just after movement restrictions and financing difficulties caused by COVID-19 containment measures complicated planting in the country.
A real fear of having food shortage. Therefore, the effect on the food system is going to be colossal. We are only praying that the rest of the country that has not suffered this will be able to augment the system.
In Africa, the virus could take a significant toll on food production itself if it sickens the aging agricultural workforce or prevents women who produce 70% of Africa's food and are often taxed with caring for the elderly from getting to the fields. This comes even as Africa is on the verge of a food crisis faced with a locust invasion, the worst infestation in the last 25 years. In East Africa, a second locust invasion hit countries in the region as they battle COVID-19. In the 6 East African countries worst affected or at risk of locust, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Tanzania, around 20 million people are already experiencing acute food insecurity.
And you find that every time you are trying to control in one region, there is another swarm that is happening in a different region, and it is not possible to control them simultaneously because most of the time they are at different stages. So it requires a lot of personnel and capacity to be able to undertake all the control operation and also managing the surveillance in terms of the ground team.
In Kenya, the Food and Agriculture Organization is training farmers to use motorized sprayers to contain the locusts. Over 1 million hectares of land in East Africa have been surveyed for locusts and over 240,000 hectares treated with chemical pesticides or biopesticides. 740 people have been trained to conduct ground locust control operations. The outbreak of COVID-19 has had an impact on the supply of motorized sprayers and pesticides. Supply of pesticides has been delayed as global air freight has reduced significantly, and restrictions on the movement of personnel and equipment imposed by governments pose a challenge, particularly for small-scale farmers.
When you want to load an aeroplane early in the morning, there is also the restrictions of timing and also locating the swarms because of the curfew. However, we are trying to come up with innovative ways like reducing the number of populations that are being met at once for the training, as well as also engaging the security officers so that they can allow a small extension of time for the locust scouts as well as the operation team.
The desert locust is considered the most destructive migratory pest in the world, and a single swarm covering 1 square kilometer can contain up to 80 million locusts.
The small-scale farmers, it's a very big problem, and for the food security of Kenya, especially after a problem like the coronavirus, how are we going to feed Kenya? All of our produce is for local consumption, and yeah, I think everyone needs to take this seriously and support everywhere you can, because it's a very big problem for Kenya as a whole.
Given the unprecedented nature of the crisis created by the pandemic, creating a better understanding of the potential impact of COVID-19 and taking rapid collective action to preempt its impact on food security and food systems are of paramount importance and urgency. Briefing the United Nations Security Council recently, World Food Programme Executive Director stressed that with COVID-19, we are not only facing a global health pandemic, but also a global humanitarian catastrophe.
Millions of civilians living in conflict-scarred nations, including many women and children, face being pushed to the brink of starvation, with the specter of famine a very real and dangerous possibility.
I thank Mr. Beasley for his briefing.
Via video link, the World Food Programme Executive Director warned the Council that while dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is also on the brink of a hunger pandemic. According to the WFP, 821 million people go to bed hungry every night all over the world, chronically hungry. And as the new global report on food crisis shows, there are a further 135 million people facing crisis levels of hunger or worse. This is a substantial rise over the last 4 years. Almost 60% of all those people in 2019 did so in context of conflict or instability.
Lockdowns, economic recessions are expected to lead to a major loss of income among the working poor. Overseas remittances will also drop sharply. This will hurt countries like Haiti, Nepal, and Somalia, just to name a couple. The loss of tourism receipts will damage countries like Ethiopia, where it accounts for 47% of its total exports. The collapsing oil prices in lower income countries like South Sudan will have an impact significantly, where oil accounts for 98.8% of total exports. And of course, when donor countries' revenues are down, how much impact will this have on life-saving foreign aid?
The executive director stated that there is also a real danger that more people could potentially die from the economic impact of COVID-19 than from the virus itself. Echoing the United Nations Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, Mr. Beasley urged the Council to lead the way to peace.
We need all parties involved in the conflicts to give us swift and unimpeded humanitarian access to all vulnerable communities so that we can get the assistance to them that they need, regardless of who they are or where they are. We also need, in a very general sense, humanitarian goods and commercial trade to continue flowing across the borders, because they are the lifeline of global food systems as well as the global economy. Supply chains have to keep moving if we are going to overcome this pandemic and get food from where it is produced to where it is needed.
I thank Mr. Beasley for
The Food and Agriculture Organization Director General also briefed the Council.
Conflict prevention, acting earlier to reduce the impacts of the conflict are highly effective steps that can be taken to avert and reduce acute food insecurity. And we need prevention, as the forecast for food security in 2020 look bleak. Conflict, extreme weather, desert locust, economic shocks, and now the COVID-19 are likely to push more people into acute food insecurity. But by closing monitoring evaluation of this shock, we can rapidly intervene to mitigate their impact.
Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council urged the Security Council to avoid politicizing access to aid.
We urge the Security Council to avoid politicizing access to aid and rather by default enable us as humanitarian actors to provide relief wherever and whenever there are unmet needs across front lines across borders, across political, religious, and ethnic lines.
COVID-19 pandemic forced many countries across the world to shut down. Scientists call it the anthropause, a global lapse in human activity when COVID-19 began its march around the world and forced us to stay put. In March, air travel dropped to 50% of what it had been in March 2019, the largest decline in recent history, according to the International Air Transport Association. Vehicular traffic around the world fell sharply. Part of India, normally blanketed by air pollution, reported being able to see the Himalayas for the first time. The space agency's Copernicus Sentinel-5P satellite mission on Friday, the 27th of March, released 3 composite images showing nitrogen dioxide concentrations from the 14th to 25th of March 2020 over France, Spain and Italy, compared to the monthly average of concentrations from 2019.
So what you really see is the centers of this pollution, or the sources of this pollution. But also the other advantage of NO2 is that it is a relatively short-lived gas. It lasts, depending a bit on weather and climate and several conditions, but it lasts roughly half a day. That means it is produced close to the source. You can monitor it close to the source. Of course, it is then dispersed in the atmosphere with the weather, wind, and all the weather elements which you see. But it is quite a good first-level indicator of anthropogenic pollution coming from traffic and industry.
Researchers studying the impact of emissions from industry and transport on climate change and human health are scrambling to understand the possible implications of the coronavirus pandemic as economies slow, flights are disrupted, and quarantines imposed.
Spectrometers are measuring in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. In this particular case, we are having measurements, so we are taking measurements in the ultraviolet, in the visible, the near-infrared, and the shortwave infrared, and there are absorption bands of NO2, and that allows us, therefore, to measure the concentration of NO2 in the atmosphere.
Nitrogen dioxide, a noxious gas emitted by cars, power plants, and factories, is blamed for some respiratory and heart conditions. Almost every city-dwelling European is exposed to pollution levels that exceed healthy levels, according to a 2019 report from European Environment Agency. But campaigners warned city dwellers were still more vulnerable to the epidemic. Data analyzed by the European Public Health Alliance showed cities including Brussels, Paris, Madrid, Milan, and Frankfurt have reduced average levels of nitrogen dioxide. The satellite pictures took a 20-day average picture between 5th and 25th of March and compared data with the same period in 2019. In Madrid, average nitrogen dioxide levels decreased by 56% week on week after the government banned on non-essential travel on the 14th of March.
If you look at the maps, the most significant changes are the regions which are heavily populated and rely on fossil fuel-based transport. So those are the areas usually around the capitals. And then the maps help us to see that if transport decreases, then so does air pollution.
But experts warn those living in polluted cities may be more at risk from COVID-19 because exposure to bad air can weaken the immune system.
Air pollution causes various chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, lung conditions. And if you suffer those conditions, you are more vulnerable to COVID-19. So you are less able to defend yourself against the disease. So that's a very serious risk.
As most economic activities have slowed down this year, a significant drop in greenhouse gases was expected. After several months of lockdown, severely reduced air traffic and closed construction sites, carbon emissions this year have only gone down 5.5% from 2019. This not only illustrates how the pandemic's impact on climate change was overstated, but it paints an entirely new picture of the scale and effort required to shift the needle in terms of carbon emissions. As the pandemic unfolded, climate disruption continued apace. 2020 is on track to be one of the 3 warmest years on record, completing a streak of 6 consecutive years, each one hotter than the other. The year was also marked by extreme weather events, from the devastating bushfires in Australia, floods in Asia and the United States, to severe drought in South America, all consequences of the climate change.
The impact of COVID on emissions is between 4 to 7%. So despite the fact that it looked like that the world stands still, we get only the decrease of 4 to 7% in emissions which we produced. So our whole economy and our consumption partners actually wire us to the extremely high emissions, even if we all sit on lockdown and limit our mobility, because lockdown is only limit on the mobility and not on our consumption.
The annual report released by the Geneva-based UN agency measures the atmospheric concentration of the gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are warming our planet and triggering extreme weather events. Levels of carbon dioxide, a product of burning fossil fuels that is the biggest contributor to global warming, touched a new record of 410.5 parts per million in 2019. The annual increase is larger than the previous year and beats the average over the last decade. World Meteorological Organization's head of atmospheric environment research said the magnitude of the increase in carbon dioxide levels over the past 4 years was comparable to changes seen during the shift from ice age to more temperate periods, but back then the transition happened over a much longer time frame.
So the CO2 which we have now in the atmosphere is accumulated since 1750. So it's every single bit which we put in the atmosphere since that time actually forms the current concentration. It's not what happened today or yesterday. It's the whole history of the human economic and human development which actually lead us to this global level of 400.
Global data is not yet available for 2020, but the trend of rising concentrations appears to be intact. Like other scientific bodies, the World Meteorological Organization said it expects annual global carbon emissions to fall this year due to COVID measures, and ventured a preliminary estimate of between 4.2 and 4.7%. Such a drop will not cause atmospheric carbon dioxide to go down, but will slow the rate of increase temporarily on a scale that falls within normal variations.
If you would like to reach carbon neutrality or this 1.5 degree target, then we should become carbon neutral by 2050. And as I said, good news is that we have now a growing amount of countries and groups of countries who have committed to that. So far, we have 50% of the global emissions which are coming from China, European Union, and Japan and South Korea.
Irrespective of what we do to curb emissions today, much of carbon dioxide already emitted decades ago remains in the atmosphere and contributes to global warming, climate scientists say.
What we find is both the low end of the range of warming is a lot less likely, but also the high end is also a little less likely. So we can be more confident in constraining the bottom end of the range than the top end. But we find really that there is some good news and some bad news, right? The bad news is that if you were hoping that warming just wouldn't end up being much of a problem, that you'd only get a degree or 2 of warming if we double our emission or double our concentrations in the atmosphere, then you should be disappointed, because we found that's not very likely. But at the same time, we found that some truly catastrophic outcomes, where we get like 5 degrees or more warming, are also a lot less likely. And so we really found that climate change is about as bad as we thought it was, that the long-term best estimate of the amount of warming you get in this sort of doubling of atmospheric CO2 is pretty close to accurate.
It also confirms that the world is on course for extreme sea level rise and other severe climate impacts. These effects are expected from a rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Already, the average global temperature has warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius.
So there's a number of climate contrarians who've argued that we don't need to worry about climate change because the Earth is probably not very sensitive to CO2. And I think this is a very strong refutation of that point. We look at three independent lines of evidence from sort of physical models of the climate, from historical observations of how the climate has changed, and from periods in the distant past, like the last ice age, for example. And all three of those give consistent estimates. And all three of them are pretty strong in excluding the possibility that we might end up with only a little bit of warming if we double our CO2. Now, it's really important to emphasize that we don't have to double CO2. In fact, I hope we don't. If we do nothing today and continue to emit at today's levels, we will. But we can, as a society, decide to reduce our emissions. And we've been making some progress toward that end in recent years. And so, this just emphasizes even more strongly the need to reduce our emissions if we want to avoid dangerous levels of warming.
And on the 12th of December this year, the Paris Agreement clocked 5. The agreement between almost 200 states on December 12, 2015, was hailed as a potential turning point in efforts to contain climate change. It called for holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Laurent Fabius, the Frenchman who brought down the gavel to seal the Paris Accord on climate change in 2015, said he wished world powers had fought global warming as resolutely as they have confronted the coronavirus pandemic.
COVID is absolutely very serious, and governments have reacted in a very bold manner with economic and financial measures and with regards to social freedoms, all very good. But in a way, climate change is even more serious, because even we forget that it has health consequences that can lead to a significant number of casualties and over several years, even more significant than COVID casualties. And it's not just a crisis, but a mutation, and there is no vaccine. And what strikes me, and this is why I talk about a grand paradox, is that unfortunately we are not doing as much to fight climate change as we are to tackle the fallout from COVID.
Avec raison, contre les conséquences de la COVID.
Mr. Fabius believes the accord has brought some success. Scientific models had projected temperatures would increase 5 or 6 degrees before its passing, and now estimated rises of 3 to 4 degrees by 2100. But this was still too high. The threshold set by the Paris Accord reflects scientists' beliefs that a rise in temperatures of more than 2 degrees would doom the planet to a future of rising sea levels, catastrophic floods, droughts and storms, and food and water shortages. Mr. Fabius, a former prime minister who was France's foreign minister at the time of the accord, recalled sleepless nights during 2 weeks of intense negotiations. The accord almost fell apart at the last moment. He has a cherished replica of the green wooden hammer. Cheers erupted and diplomats hugged as his gavel came down as they announced the accord's approval. The United States, the world's second largest greenhouse gas emitter after China, formally exited the accord on November 4 this year.
Il y a l'évolution considérable qu'est l'élection de Joe Biden, qui a fait campagne.
The situation has evolved significantly with the election of Joe Biden, who campaigned significantly on rejoining the Paris Agreement and on promoting green energy and green jobs. Now they will get to work in a few weeks. He knows that it will not be easy, and on the other hand, to get things moving, we need every country in the world to act, not just one country. But obviously, it's a big sign of hope.
Dear friends,
in his year-end message, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, 2020 has been a year of trials, tragedies and tears. And made an appeal for making 2021 a year of healing. He said the world should work in unity and solidarity against the backdrop of a year dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the persistent suffering and grief it has brought with it.
The central ambition of the United Nations for 2021 is to build a global coalition for carbon neutrality, net zero emissions by 2050. Every government, city, business and individual can play a part in achieving this vision. Together, let's make peace among ourselves and with nature, tackle the climate crisis, stop the spread of COVID-19 and make 2021 a year of healing. Healing from the impact of a deadly virus, healing broken economies and societies, healing divisions, and starting to heal the planet. That must be our New Year's resolution for 2021.
In 2020, a pandemic sickened millions and destroyed livelihoods around the world. It also showed what was within reach with ambitious, decisive action. So as we say goodbye to 2020 and hello to 2021, let's all bear in mind that we have only one planet, and when we care for nature, it will definitely take care of us. That's it from all of us here in Lagos. We'll see you next year. Do take care.